So class components are so yesterday. And what we're going to do is refactor this component to use a normal React functional component and to replace our functionality where we're using state and React lifecycle methods, and we're going to achieve the same thing just using React hooks instead. Now React hooks are new as at React 16.8. And the goal of hooks in React is they allow us to use state and other React features such as lifecycle methods without writing a class. Now the idea behind hooks is that they're, in theory, easier to learn because we don't need to worry about the concept of this inside a JavaScript class, which can be a point of confusion when you first start using JavaScript. And they also make our code somewhat cleaner and easier to understand. Now we're going to introduce two hooks at this stage. One of them is going to be the state hook, and this is going to replace the functionality we're using inside our component state. And the other one we're going to introduce is the effect hook. And the effect hook lets us perform side effects in function components. And what this one allows us to do is, if we compare it to the React lifecycle method we're using at the moment to go out and get our activities from the API, we're using component did mount. Now useEffect can be used as a substitute for this, but it's also two other lifecycle methods rolled into one as well. It also includes the functionality inside this for component did update and component will unmount combined. But we'll get into the detail of this when we use it. First of all, let's go and refactor our class component to a React functional component. Now we're not going to be using state or component state anymore, so we can remove our interface. And we can also remove our state in here as well. And for our component, instead of a class, we'll use a const. And instead of this extends component, what we'll do is we'll just use an arrow function here. So we'll specify const app equals parentheses and then the arrow. And then what we want to do is remove our component did mount, but I'm just going to comment this one out for now. And I need to make my arrow function an actual arrow function. And also, because we're now just using a React functional component, we no longer have access to the render method. So let's also remove this and remove its closing brackets down here as well. And I'll just reformat and see where we're at. Now we've got our list.states.activities, and what we want to do is change this into using a React hook. And the one that we're going to use to replace this is one called useState. So instead of bringing in components, I'm just going to bring in useState from React. And the way that we use this useState hook is we define a const and pass in an array. And this array has two elements. First of all, it has the state itself, and then it has a function that we use to set the state. So we'll call it set activities. And then we'll say use state. And we need to give this some initial state. And in this case, we'll just say it's an empty array. And instead of saying list.state.activities, now we can just say activities.map and then activity. Now we're getting some TypeScript errors here because the property ID does not exist on type never. So what we need to specify is the type that our useState is using, and it's currently set to use its default type in this case, which is never. But we want to adjust this to a type of activity and array. And if we take a look down, now that's resolved the particular errors down here. But of course, we're not bringing back our activities at this moment, and if I go to my page, then we just see the blank screen where our activities should be. So in order to get our data back from the API, we're going to need to use the useEffect hook. and also the set activities, so that when we get our activities from the API, we can use this set activities function so that we can populate our activities state here. So let's take a look at the other React hook we're going to use in this case, and it's going to be use effect. And just below our use state method, what we'll do is we'll say use effect, and use effect accepts a function that contains imperative, possibly effectful code. So what we'll do is we'll say use effect, and this takes a function, so I'll add in an arrow function here. And then what we can do is use the same code that we did in the component did mount method, and just copy and paste this inside our use effect method. And I'll just uncomment the code and just reformat. And then in the response here, what we need to do, instead of using this.setState, we're simply going to use the set activities, and we're going to say set activities, and then we need to pass in our array of activities, and we can get that from our response.data. And because our response is returning an array of activities, then when we use set activities, our response.data is strongly typed to our array of activities, so we don't get any complaints from TypeScript. And what we can do now is remove our component did mount method, because we no longer need that, or can even use that inside here. And what we also want to do, quite importantly in this case, is add a second parameter here, and just an empty array. And what this does is ensures that our use effect runs one time only and doesn't continuously run, because every time our component renders, then this use effect method would be called. And it's only by adding this second parameter of an empty array that we prevent that kind of behavior. Now let's just go back and check that our activities are being returned as they were before. And if I take a look at my browser, I can refresh the page and we get the activities. Now, I just want to explain what this second parameter is doing for us. And I mentioned earlier that this use effect is 3 component lifecycle methods kind of rolled into one. Now we've got the component did mount equivalent here. What we could also do is add a parameter in here that would check against any properties we've received, and if the properties have changed, then it will cause this method to rerun again. And by adding an empty array, we prevent this from running a second or third time, or however many times. And if I just go back to my browser again, I'm just going to inspect and open the network tab, and I'm just going to click refresh, and we can see we get our activities, and there's just one call to the activities. Now, please don't do this, what I'm about to do. But if I remove the array here, then what's going to happen is I'm going to send my component into a loop. Because if I don't have this here, then there's nothing to stop this from running every single time my component renders. Now when we use this use effect side effect, I'm going to go out and get my activities and then set the state for the activities. If this isn't here, then once this activities has been set, then our use effect is going to be called again. It's going to go and get the activities and then set the activities and repeat. So let me just show you how this works. And I'm just going to remove the array. And then if I go back, we can see the chaos that's now going on inside my network tab. So I'm just going to put that back and return to normal. And now we can see that the insanity has stopped and we're back to just running this a single time to go and get our activities. So this use effect hook is one to use with care. And if I go down to what we're doing here and why we're doing what we're doing, then it all comes down to the fact that this particular lifecycle method, or this use effect hook, has these 3 methods rolled into one. And what we've done here is very much the equivalent of just component did mount, because that particular lifecycle method would run once when the component mounts, and it would never run again, or until the component was reinitialized. The component did update is a check to see if any new properties have been received by a component, And if they have, then the component will update. And what we could use is, back in our hook, is we could add a property that we were receiving in this component, and we could check against that property to see if it has been updated. But we're not passing any properties into our application here, or into our app components. Now there's a third part of the use effect, and that's the component will amount. And we can use this to clean up anything that we need to in this use effect hook. So if we were subscribing to something, we could use it to unsubscribe. Now we're not going to cover this use effect hook in detail at the moment, but what we have done here is really just replaced our component did mount by adding this empty array. That's what it's doing for us. It's preventing this from running again after our component has mounted. And we're now back in the same position we were before with our component, but now we're using hooks instead of a component class. And we won't be creating any more component classes at all in the building of this application. And what we'll look at next is actually making our application resemble an application. And we're going to start adding some style and some components to make this look a bit better. And we'll start to look at that next, starting with the navbar.